Hi, I'm Chadlack. I'm your host for the Cage Rage podcast. Welcome back.
I'm Miguel Andrade for the Cage Rage podcast, and be it MMA or boxing, this is where you want to be.
Hey, I'm Chadlack. Welcome back to the Cage Rage podcast. We're glad to see you all again. Our numbers are growing weekly. Don't forget to subscribe below. We appreciate all the comments and all the emails we've been receiving. We're trying to answer them as quickly as we can. I apologize for not getting back to them. That's totally on me. I promise you that I will get to your answers. We also have started this new thing where you send in, and if I select your email and we answer your email question online on one of the podcasts, then we'll send you a t-shirt or a hat or a sticker or whatever weird shit we come up with. We haven't even come up with a logo yet, so we're still trying to figure that out. But I promise you that when we do that, you're going to be the first to get your cool stuff. So stick around for the Cage Rage podcast because the CRP is growing leaps and bounds every day, and we're having a blast doing it. Hey, Miguel, how's it going, buddy? How you doing?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm good. You know what? I was watching the Joe Rogan podcast, an old one with Chael Sonnen, and Chael was like, so we're already rolling? And Joe goes, yeah, we don't do any that bullshit. We don't do introductions and all that stuff. And I thought, well, we do introductions. And Rogan said, you know, we don't need all that bullshit. And I was like, well, I guess we're not Joe Rogan. And then Chael said, well, I do introductions. And I was like, okay, if Chael can do introductions, we can do introductions too. So I don't feel so bad about it, right? I mean, we've got to do introductions because we're not Joe Rogan. I mean, that guy gets like 700 trillion views a week or whatever. He's the king of the podcast world, and he's doing something pretty spectacular.
Everybody knows who he is. You know, everybody knows who he is. Everybody knows who Chael is. No one knows who we are, so you're going to have to listen to our introductions. I'm sorry.
That's correct. And you know what? Everybody knows a little bit about the word Cage Rage. And so that's kind of why we picked the Cage Rage podcast, because we had a lot of different options. But Cage Rage has been around forever. I started Cage Rage in 1999, and it's been growing ever since. Subsequently, the English Cage Rage is also mine. It just happens to be that Ian Freeman and I had a legal battle about that I won't go into on air. But Ian, you're a son of a bitch, bloke. So here we go. Today we are talking about the history of MMA, specifically when MMA was still the good old days, and it was called NHB, or No Holds Barred Fighting. This is back when it was the Wild Wild West. There was a thing called IVC in Brazil, and a lot of fighters came from the Midwest, specifically Indiana. And even if they didn't come from Indiana, they came through Indiana. And the reason for that was that, which is why Cage Rage was so big, and we became relevant so fast. Miguel was with a group called Hook and Shoot, which was in Evansville, Indiana, which is, in terms of Indiana, it might as well be on the other side of the world. Evansville is on the very edge of Kentucky, on the southwest side of the state, and Cage Rage is in north central Indiana. So we're way up here in the middle of boondocks nowhere, and so never the two should meet. And somehow Miguel and I crossed paths, luckily enough, because they had a spectacular show going on at Hook and Shoot, which was recognized, if I'm correct in saying this, Miguel, as the second best show on the planet at that time. Would you agree with that?
I don't get into rating stuff like that. I think what we were doing was stuff that was noticeable. I think, you had to follow MMA on, you had the budding internet, and you had people looking for information about this stuff, and, UFC kind of bringing it to light in '93, and whereas we pointed out in previous podcasts, there were groups going in the late '80s, in other countries and stuff. So it was just a good place to tap into, and yeah, we successfully had international fights in Evansville, Indiana, and I think that's a good achievement.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of the day, to give people an idea, Chad's closer to Chicago, and Evansville's like closer to St. Louis. So it is, you know, 4 hours. It might as well be 40.
Yeah, and so the truth is that we were surrounded in Indiana. We were surrounded by all states that MMA, well, NHB still at that point, was completely illegal, and so you couldn't do it. It was sort of like, you know, when boxing was illegal in the days prior to Queensberry rules. As we talk, you know, historically about boxing, MMA went through the same sort of growth period where it was completely illegal. There was they wanted governing bodies and they wanted commissions, and they, you know, what is this thing? Um, Senator McCain, may he rest in peace, was my direct adversary, and I actually campaigned against him in Senate, and actually spoke against him a couple of different times, and wrote many a letter. American hero he was, but friend to MMA, I would say, was definitely not his forte at that time. Later, he got on board. But the point is that we were called human cockfighters and all kinds of stuff back then, and people didn't know what to think of it. And it was normal when we were handing out flyers and saying, hey, we're going to do a show, for people to say, is anyone going to die? And back then we would have to, we would downplay it and say, oh, you know, no, God, this is a sport and we're athletes and we respect one another. And, you know, you had to play it down and like really play up the whole, you know, peace and love theme to it, instead of the I'm going to kill you theme. And we sold incredible numbers of tickets on pieces of flyer paper printed on cheap printers. You know, it was incredible. And then, you know, later as it grew in popularity and people started to understand it and discover it, then it was, you know, is anyone going to die? Well, you know, who knows? We can't tell. Because, you know, you started to have to sell it in a different light. I digress. So the point is that Indiana became the melting pot for MMA because it was illegal pretty much everywhere except Iowa and Indiana at one point even. Wisconsin was had a gray law, and so it was sort of legal in parts of Wisconsin. Parts of Wisconsin it was not. So it wasn't legal in Milwaukee, if I remember right. But Dave Strasser had a show there in Kenosha, and so it was legal there, and that was a fantastic event. And then pretty much other than that, for the Midwest, it was cage rage. There was a show in Muncie, Indiana, which is the home of Ball State University, where David Letterman went to university, which was Chaz Boland's show, the ECC, or Extreme Combat Challenge. And then lower down the state was Hook and Shoot in Evansville, Indiana. And so Indiana became this huge melting pot where people came from literally all over the country and then soon all over the world to fight because they wanted to compete in the United States, because the United States became this hotbed of MMA. You know, there wasn't a single black belt in Indiana. There wasn't a single black belt in the Midwest at that point. And so no one knew anything. And so if you knew a little bit of Sambo, or if you were a really high-level wrestler, or if you could Thai box, you were automatically kind of guaranteed to win a couple tiers on the tournament. So from there, guys like Miguel, who were bilingual, who had a job where he traveled often, and who also had an intense vision of what he believed MMA could be when it was still NHB, got tied into a group called IVC in Brazil. And although Brazil speaks Portuguese and Spanish are very closely related, sort of the way that Italian and Spanish are closely related. And so Miguel was able to go down there and gap and bridge the language barrier more easily than other people were able to some degree, and became the liaison between the Midwest and Brazil. So, having said all of that, Miguel, take us from there, and correct me where I was wrong on that. If I messed up, tell me, and then just kind of take the audience, take us on a ride, and take us on an historic view of the IVC, where it began, who was in charge. Give us some dates, some years, some numbers. Give us some basics to start out with.
All right, so the IVC, great intro. There's so much to talk about, Chad. It's hard to get started. I mean, the bottom line is you said no holds barred, NHB and stuff, and there was another word for it that was used out there, a word that people had heard, and it is a little Portuguese, and it was called Vale Tudo.
Yes.
And you heard Vale Tudo, which Vale Tudo is anything goes, basically, is the exact translation of it. Vale todo in the Spanish, Vale Tudo in Portuguese. So you had the idea of no rules in Brazil. And then in 1997, you had the appearance of Sergio Batarelli. And God bless Batarelli, because, I would consider Batarelli one of the true pioneers that he's still around. I recently saw him with a couple of Brazilian boxers as their translator on television and things like that. So he's still in the fight business, working, internationally and stuff like that. And, I want to say a big hello to Sergio. I consider him, a friend and a pioneer in the sport. He starts the IVC, and the IVC is just really, it is the show that could have gotten the sport banned. When you look at everything that the states had to face, Batarelli was very, very, very much a purist. He didn't want any rules, and they thrived off that. Some of the videos of them, you see absurd scenes, like compared to what you think of in MMA now, with like a guy who's taking enough headbutts that his eyelid and stuff, he's pouring blood out, and the referee is just kind of mopping the blood off, to the side and off of the mat and stuff. There's no consideration of stopping the fight or anything like that. So it definitely was a different vision of the sport. And he definitely wanted headbutts and no gloves, and for it to be as street as MMA, mixed martial arts. Yeah, you can use anything from any of the. So when you talk about a rude show, you talk about a rude show. This was a show that the mainstream fan now is still not going to look at and say, oh, that's it doesn't look like the sport now anymore.
Yeah.
They had a ring with a little net around the bottom, so the little net was meant to prevent people from crawling out of the ring. But as happens, you can put a guy into the net and then pull the net over him. You know what I mean? And this happened in the fights, and the ref is, observing. He's got the best seat in the house, but he's not doing a lot of enforcing, So it really was very, very different than what you see today. You don't get that level of back to the basics kind of thing.
In IVC, were gis allowed?
Yeah, you can wear whatever you want.
Okay.
Barring boots and stuff like that. You can't. But in IVC, it was International Vale Tudo Championship, and the first one, the tournament, and it was a tournament with wrestlers, and they're Gary Goodridge fought in the first one, and the first IVC has that historic match where Gary Goodridge fought the Pedro. The Pedro. To me, a Brazilian legend. I remember meeting the Pedro. I was so happy to meet him because, this guy was definitely just, street fight, not a lot of technique, but he would fight anybody. And, I think, not an elite guy, but man, he was just a nut. And,
Primal.
So anyway, the Pedro and him having this fight, this is the fight where Gary Goodridge, squeezed the Pedro's nuts in his cup. He removed the guy's cup, stuck his hand in there, squeezed his nuts until the fight was stopped. So
how was that fight stopped? Did LePetro, did he tap or?
The details are going to escape me because I haven't seen it in a long time, and I
don't remember.
This is the very first one, but. Goodrich, you can see it on the tape that Goodrich makes a very deliberate effort to get into the guy's cup. At some point, he takes advantage of it. And the Pedro's been complaining the whole fight with this. And it's still, the kind of thing where it's like, I talked to the Pedro after that. The guy was so indignant. He just couldn't believe it, it had come to that. I mean, there really is no rules. So Goodrich was, all right with that. But he thought there was a transgression there that was never going to be forgiven. And it was just kind of interesting to meet the guy after that, knowing that, that's in the context of everything. But the Pedro was a character, man. The guy would walk into the room and, he'd be there, waiting to do the interview. He'd stand there, making mean faces at you. And you're like, what's going on with this guy? So, anyway, the IVC was fun, but there was always an element of that. I'll tell you a great Sergio Batarelli story. Batarelli worked with the UFC and Bob Meyerowitz to bring the UFC Brazil, the very first one, down where, Vitor Belfort fought
Vanderlei Silva.
Frank Shamrock fought John Lober. Batarelli brought that UFC down to Brazil. He was part of that. And he had his shows and stuff. And Batarelli and I were standing next to each other at the moment that Vitor Belfort and Vanderlei Silva were beginning to enter the ring for their fight. And there was a tension in the crowd, and you could see the crowd. It was in São Paulo, and you could see the crowd start to go wild. Jeremy Horn was with us. Horn he was so depressed because he had just lost his fight to Ebenezer Braga. Braga they're very similar fighters, very gritty fighters. I think Braga was just further along than Jeremy was. Jeremy probably would win that fight in the future, but
yeah.
The road trip, everything, Horn was at the very start of his career. And, he put on a ball cap and nobody bothered the guy. And he's standing in the crowd. He's, you see he'd been in a fight and stuff. And it was Horn and Batarelli. And these guys are starting to enter. And I just asked Sergio, I was like, do you have enough security? Because he was the ground promoter for the thing, right?
Man.
And he looked at me and he said, "We're going to find out."
God damn.
Nobody knew. So it was definitely
they think that, today's modern crowd, they think that the Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor incident was a big deal. And oh my God, somebody jumped over the fence. And, I've seen 100 MMA shows, and specifically NHB shows or Vale Tudo shows, wherein the audience, there's 30 people in the audience fighting while the fight's still going on, and there's 5 security guards trying to deal with that, and half the security's still trying to watch the fight, and you're like, you have to deal with this. And, in those early days, it was rough. There were a lot of things to overcome that we had to learn how to do early.
And that's where you got to take your hat off to Batarelli and the IVC.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell you, the bottom line is Sergio was beginning to produce an international event. He was never able to pay Mark Coleman to fight, but he would bring Mark Coleman down and give Mark Coleman's fighters opportunities to fight. There were other promoters operating in Brazil, but definitely Batarelli stood above the crowd and was a guy that did care about stuff. And part of that is that Batarelli was a guy you didn't really want to mess with either. He had that shrewd, this to him that he had all bases covered. I can tell you stories. If you remember UFC fighter Renato Babalu.
Oh, yeah.
I remember
Babalu, man.
I remember Babalu got caught trying to sneak some friends into one of the IVC events, and it did not go well for Babalu at that. And I'm not saying he got beat up, but I'm saying he got talked down by security, and nobody got in. There was another one of those events that I was at where Vanderlei Silva was fighting. Pele wasn't fighting. His teammate Pele Landy wasn't fighting.
Oh,
but the Pele
Landy that's a legend.
But the Pele-Jorge Macaco rivalry, that was real shit, And with the boys from Curitiba in Sao Paulo, there was Jorge Macaco and his group outside waiting and the whole thing. So there was definitely some of those events were definitely Wild West type of scenes.
Yeah, and that's important to point out too. That back then the rivalries those weren't contrived and made up for camera and pay-per-view sales. Those were real. Those were gyms that hated each other, and it was like, my gym's better than yours. My art is better than yours. My style's better. And I'm going to fucking kill you when I get a hold of you. And guys actually wanted to fucking kill each other. That was part of it.
Yeah. I mean,
it was so raw, and so there was a form of, as brutal and barbaric as it was to me, and I am a purist, and I wanted to keep everything absolutely pure, and I knew that we couldn't last that way, and so I instituted rules right away and that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that, but had I been able to, I would have most certainly kept it completely Vale Tudo and done everything as pure as I could to the very end. I would, if I had the opportunity, I would still be promoting that today. But, you know, obviously that's just not the way things worked out. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, so at this point, you know, the stories that come from that, and one of the reasons why I'm glad it's evolved beyond that a little bit, it's there as a historical piece. I think it's important. I think it's important that it was documented, so that in many ways, maybe that takes away some of the repetition, because I think guys already fought that level of rawness before. You know what I mean? Even in boxing in the 1850s, 1860s, you know, when they had fights to the finish, you know, to finish a man, to fight 75 rounds, that sort of stuff, you know, that's a different animal than the sport we're looking at now. And IVC definitely had that rawness, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think, you know, to this day, Sergio would do fights like that. I think Brazil has had different editions of it, but I think everybody benefits from it. The real reason, you know, it is spectacle there. The sport changes, and it definitely changes the fights and stuff with the less rules. And maybe the athletes and stuff, but what you have here is exactly what you described. Gym rivalries that when someone like myself, an outsider, comes and sees them, you really, you see superstars. You know, you're like,
yep,
Vanderlei Silva's this guy should be in a ring. This guy shouldn't be, you know, fighting in gyms and stuff. This guy should be in a big, you know, to see the guy up close when he was 20. You know, when he was 21 or however old he was at that point, yeah, those guys took their rivalry seriously with Macaco. They wanted, you know, that was the be-all, end-all to them. But then, taken to Japan, they became things. But at the end of the day, there was that feeling of like, wow, there's something here. These guys are you know, hopefully not destined to wind up in jail because they're beating each other up in gyms, you know what I mean? Or doing gym raids or, you know, God knows if it escalates at some point, you know, to weapons or stuff like that, if it just stays on the street. So Vale Tudo comes up and kind of, you know, becomes an outlet for this stuff. But those, you know, the stuff that happened in some of those fights, the reason why I'd be against headbutts now is precisely some of those things, you know? I remember going there with a fighter that you know Henry Matamoros.
Yeah, Henry, what's up, baby? Love you, man.
Hey, ahí estamos, hermanito, no? Henry, you know, went down to fight Vanderlei Silva's trainer, Rafael Cordero. You know, Cordero.
And what was the weight difference in that, by the way?
No, it was the same weight. He was a little guy, but Cordero is known now in a world-class trainer. His last MMA fight was against Henry. And they fought 30 minutes with no gloves, no stop, no break. And at the end of the day, both guys respected each other after that fight. And their team respected Henry. You know, I think compared to some of the fighters other people bought down there, my guy weathered a little bit more of a storm than some of the others.
Yeah.
You know, and therefore we got in with Sergio. Sergio liked us, and I had the opportunity to bring the little guys in. I got to say, it was always on Henry's sweat and blood. You know what I mean? But getting back to your thing about headbutts, is I remember coming home from that fight in the airport, and Henry's face is swollen, and having a couple of caipirinhas, which is you know, Brazilian drink. And Henry comes up to me and goes, "Look, check this out." And he's got a hole here from being headbutted, and he's blowing bubbles. He closes his mouth, and he can blow bubbles through a hole here.
Oh, God, that's disgusting.
Well, you know, it makes for a good story, right? But here's the thing is I've already seen that. and we've all, you know, hopefully the sport's already seen that. There's an
Yeah.
example there. There are other examples of injuries and things like that. There's reasons why headbutts are banned, and they weren't just to get technique out of Mark Coleman. You know what I mean?
Yeah, most certainly. Well, look, we have an upcoming podcast that we've been kind of teasing our audience about, where we're going to go very deeply into the idea of that there's a reckoning coming in MMA, where head injury is going to have to be addressed, and where chronic traumatic encephalopathy is going to have to be addressed in a very serious manner, where money is going to come into play, and where these guys that have been taking headshots for all of these years, there's a reckoning coming for all of that. And so headbutts are a big part of one of the main reasons that headbutts had to be taken out was for fighter safety, and we know that. But in the early days, before we thought about things like traumatic brain injury, because remember, the NFL hadn't even started talking about concussions yet at this time. So we're talking about the 90s still here, or the early aughts at the latest. And so, having said that, headbutts were not a concern about whether or not somebody was going to be, a vegetable by the time they were 37 years old. It was more about, well, it kind of takes away from the sport, and it makes it so that the top guy can just sit there and headbutt a guy, and it doesn't make things as exciting. And a lot of the big changes that we saw from Vale Tudo over to MMA were really more about making it more exciting for the crowd to see than anything to do with fighter safety or any of that kind of stuff. And then it was also about, shit, we have to do something to make sure we can keep this legal. And there are some of these things that we're just not going to do. Remember when Chemo fought Guy Metzger, and they both had the long ponytails, and when they were going into the ring, they both kind of said, hey, I won't pull yours if you don't pull mine. We used to have fights when I still fought, which
got Metzger, I think, but
when I still fought, which I fought NHB, I only fought a couple of MMA matches. Almost everything I did was NHB, and I was not a great fighter by any means, so don't take this like I'm saying I have mattered. But I did fight for whatever that's worth, and we used to have sort of like gentlemen's agreements where it would be like, hey, I won't gouge your eyes or bite your nose off, or let's not punch each other in the balls and stuff like that. We kind of had agreements about stuff like that, but there were no rules to it. And so a lot of times what you would see is, especially as a wrestler who was really short and super powerful back then, I would, slam guys because I could get their back pretty easily with duck unders. And, they would start to lose and start to be suffocated by me. And then the agreement would kind of go out the window really fast. And all of a sudden, they're gouging my eyes, and they're trying to bite me, and they're pulling my hair and stuff like that. And so there became this separation between what we considered to be a real fighter and a thug. And the thugs kind of got pushed out very, very quickly because they would get fucked up really, really quickly. And sometimes they got fucked up in the locker room before they ever made it to the I mean, hell, back then a lot of times we fought in between cars and stuff, but it was a different time, I guess. But anyways, to get back to it, so what else about the IVC? So you go through the first one, you've got the UFC goes down, and they do the IVC UFC thing. They called that like UFC 12 and a half or something.
It was up to 17 and a half or something. Yeah. But UFC Brazil,
Yeah. It was so that's kind of a weird bookmark thing. And there's the whole story about Vitor Belfort was crying in the back room because he was afraid of Wanderlei Silva. That was his first big fight. And then he goes out there and he's so terrified that he destroys Wanderlei. And they never fought again, right?
If they did, it was much, much later. I don't even recall if it happened. But I was there for that. The bottom line is Vitor checked out of the hotel and left the hotel and checked himself into a different hotel and sent his mother to renegotiate with the UFC before he fought Vanderlei. He did go into the ring and he did get the job done. I spoke to Vitor myself after that, and he looked at me and he said, you know, I had a lot more to lose than Vanderlei. A lot more to lose. So he was nervous. He was nervous about it. I spoke to Vanderlei afterwards, and
well, he was a kid.
Yeah, he was young. I spoke to Vanderlei, and Rudimar, a young Brazilian kid named Mauricio, helped me get in the door with those guys, and we interviewed them on video for the Fight World Video magazine and stuff. But Vanderlei Silva, I've never seen a guy that crushed or that, just because he didn't even get a chance in that fight. You know what I mean? So, and then from there, we at the IVCs, he actually came back and fought like 2 fights afterwards in the IVC, bouncing back from the Vitor Belfort loss. So they always went back there. Pele fought there. Indiana legend Phyllis Lee used to bring fighters down there a great deal. So there was an international mix of people meeting down there, and Sergio was really one of the first people that had a worldwide vision. I remember meeting Kawasaki there, who at the time was one of the agents for Pride.
Yeah.
There were some contacts and things that were made that Batarelli was definitely a visionary that kind of deserves credit, But
hey,
they were crazy shows.
Hey, here's an old name for you, since we're talking NHB and early days stuff. Becky Levi, you knew Becky, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Becky was at IVC, and she had just got
the first IVC where the Gary Goodwin won the tournament. Dan Severn was the main event.
Yeah. So Becky's there with Dan, and she just gotten back, and Dan stopped, and I had a cage rage. I don't know, like the next weekend or whatever. So Dan and Becky came down because they always came to my shows and we were friends. And Becky said that they had wanted her to do a fight, but then it was, or I don't know how it worked out, but there was some kind of a deal where they expected Becky to come down and do a girls fight on the side. But when they got there and they saw what Becky looked like, and she was like, hey, if they wanted me to do a fucking cat fight, I'd have brought a cat with me. You know what I mean? I'd have killed this fucking chick, And I said, yeah, Becky. I said, I don't think they had the right idea about you being a real fighter. And she was like, hey, I know I'm a big girl. She goes, I'm not trying to go out there and wear a fucking bikini and get in a fist fight. I'm going to go out there and kick the shit out of somebody. And Becky could have beat up a lot of men back then. But anyways, the point of the story is that Becky said, and I'd not been there. I had not been to Brazil to see the conditions. And I said, so what's it like there? And she said, put it this way. We had to go to the emergency room to get one of our guys stitched up. And so they'd apparently taken a couple of guys from Dan and Becky's Danger Zone show, which was up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they had to do it in Fort Wayne, although they were from Michigan. They stepped over into Fort Wayne, which is literally right on the Michigan line, because again, it was illegal everywhere except Indiana. And so they were doing the Danger Zone there, and they had taken somebody for sort of a preliminary fight on top of Dan being the main card, and he'd gotten cut, and so they take him to the hospital to get stitched up. And Becky said the doctor's smoking a cigarette and stitching the guy up. And she said there's blood all over the floors. Nothing's getting cleaned up. She said literally the emergency room looked like a MASH unit in a war zone. She said I'd never seen anything like it. She said, I would have put glue on my eye and waited to get home to stitch it up because I'd have been afraid of infection. She said, but we had a hell of a good time.
I can tell you a story about an IVC event.
Please.
Where a fighter, he got hurt in the fight, and it was a leg injury, and he was hobbling around and stuff. He said, no, I ain't going to no Brazilian hospital. So I guess those stories got around with Becky and stuff. You know, but he said, no, I'm not going to Brazil hospital. I'm going out.
Which IVC was this?
Just one of the later ones. We're going to protect the guilty here. So
you don't want to share the exact IVC number?
Person's still out there, and I have a family now and that sort of stuff. So,
where was the person from?
Did I go into that? All right, all right, yeah, no, the guy's still out there, and you know, he may have a family now that he didn't have then, and that sort of stuff. So I'm gonna skirt around some details here, but the bottom line is that you know, he got a leg injury, and he refused medical care, and he said, I'm going out to party, and he went, you know, to one of those establishments with you know, Brazilian ladies that were going to provide the taking care of aspect, you know.
I don't follow.
You know what I mean, Chad? So anyway, so he goes off to the.
You mean like
Yeah, like a whorehouse, like a cat house.
Oh, you mean a whorehouse?
Yeah. So anyway, but the funny part of it is the next day I see.
They have those in Brazil.
On occasion, yeah, they're there. You have to dig, really dig. You have to really look for them. I mean, you can miss them. But at any rate, this person found him, and he comes back the next day, and he's hobbling around the hotel lobby, and we're having breakfast with you know, most of the people. And it's post-fight, so there's, you know, that feeling of post-fight and stuff.
That whole burnout, and everybody's hungover, and it's quiet. And
everybody's gonna be leaving, you know, the whole thing, and like opponents, like, you know, meeting, you know, and
everybody's friendly.
And yeah, it was all right. So
exchanging business cards and numbers.
Guy comes up to me, he goes, man. I had a great party, man. I had sex with 9 different women.
Wow, like, 9. Okay, so did he have a broken leg?
There was damage done to parts of his leg. Yeah, I don't think it was a break, but
I mean, you know, anyway, like torn ligaments and like really bad off.
Yeah, I'm not getting into details.
Okay, so you're not getting into details, but he had a very severe problem with his leg.
He came home, went to the
hospital. Instead of going to the hospital, he opts to go to a place of irreputable, and
a place where a different type of nurse was going to take care of him. Right?
He's got a different idea of nursing, and he goes there, and he has 9 different nurses.
But here's the part that's interesting. It's funny, and this is the part why I tell the story, because I find it funny. So I was
that's
like,
impressive.
9 different women. I was like, that's what I said. I said 9 different women. That's amazing.
Wow.
And he goes,
after a fight.
Yeah, man. He goes, yeah, man. I had 3 threesomes. And I look at him and I say, you big dummy. That's only 6 women. You can't count yourself. And that's a true story. It's kind of, you know, you can see why I don't want to share it with everybody. You know, names can be protected.
Okay, I'm just going to tell you right now, there is no fucking way that that's not a human being that's not from the Midwest.
Yeah, it is a Midwest person.
That's a Midwest human being. I'm not fucking stupid. That's a Midwest human being. I'm from Indiana. I know these things. That guy's got to be from the Midwest. Where? I'm not going to speculate. But like I said, they came from all over the Midwest, so it's hard to tell. Oh, that's great. That's totally awesome. Man, we had great times, and you know, we're going to do a lot more of this. I think we've hit our time limit on this one, so we got to wrap this one up. We've got a lot of stuff to do. Hey, don't forget to subscribe below. Cadillac at thecageragepodcast.com. Miguel at thecageragepodcast.com. We're going to be covering, we've got a brain injury podcast coming up that we're going to be covering pretty soon. So this is just another teaser on that. We've also got a couple of big fights, one in the UFC that's coming up we're going to talk about. We're going to cover some stuff on one that's been happening that we want to talk about as far as MMA stuff is concerned. And then we've got another boxing update to cover too with the great Floyd Mayweather. So a couple podcasts coming up. We're going to be shooting pretty soon. We'll have those out for you in the next several days. This one should be out hopefully tomorrow, I think. It's currently Friday, so Saturday this one will be out hot on the presses for you. Anything else to add to this before we go, Miguel? This one's been really fun, man. I love looking back at the old days, and you know, we were there, and God damn, it was amazing to be there.
No, yeah, I enjoy the memories. A walk down memory lane doesn't do any harm to anybody. It's fun, and lets me take my hat off to Sergio Batarelli, like a true old friend. Haven't talked to him in a while, but nothing but good things to say, really.
Yeah, and I want to throw in there just one other thing. Man, we mean no disrespect to anybody that we met in those days. In fact, we have all the respect in the world, because without that infrastructure being there, and without the people that sacrificed so much literal blood and sweat and tears and bone and skin and everything that went along with it, and all the stuff that guys like Miguel and Jeff Osborne did, and so many more, Becky and Dan, so many guys that were out there that were busting their asses and promoting and doing what they had to do to make this work. And Dana White, let's not forget Dana White. Let's not forget Fertitas. Let's not forget the entire repertoire of different people that made MMA happen and build it into what it is today, because people do not realize the shitstorm that we had to go through and what it was like to never know if your show was going to go off or if you were going to get shut down and things like that. So, have a little goddamn respect. And when you look at stuff like that, remember that the kids that are doing this stuff today need to look back and with a little bit of reverie and respect and understand that somebody had to build this.
And we'll do more looks back. I enjoyed the IVCs. I judged a few of them, and I accompanied fighters for a few of them. I met a lot of people down there. From Brazil, I got to go to Brazil for other reasons involving fights that weren't with the IVC, and I'll always remember those shows pretty fondly. So my hat's off again, like I said, to Sergio and to all the men who stepped into that fucking grinder of a ring, man. God. Every one of you guys, hats off, man. Thank you.
Namaste.